I didn't expect my own wife to introduce me like I didn't exist. Those were the exact words running through my head the moment I stepped into the ballroom, where the soft glow of chandeliers and the quiet clink of glasses made everything feel too polished, too perfect, like a world I was never meant to be part of. My name is Jack Turner, and for most people in that room, I was nobody worth remembering. I stood just a step behind my wife, Emily Turner, as she guided me through the entrance of the corporate dinner hosted at one of downtown Chicago's high-end hotels, the kind of place where even the air smells expensive and every smile feels rehearsed. She looked confident, effortless, completely in her element, greeting coworkers and executives like she belonged to that world in a way I never did. I stayed quiet, as I always did in situations like this, letting her lead, letting her shine. Then it happened. A coworker of hers, a man named Mark Sullivan, leaned in slightly as he shook her hand and asked casually who I was. There was a brief pause, just a fraction of a second, but it felt longer than it should have. Emily smiled, the kind of smile I had learned over the years could mean many things, but rarely something soft. She turned slightly toward him and said, loud enough for the nearby table to hear, "Oh, that's my husband. He's just a mechanic." Just a mechanic. The words didn't land all at once. They spread slowly, like a drop of ink bleeding through paper. I felt a few heads turn in my direction, followed by the faintest sound of laughter that tried to stay polite but couldn't fully hide what it really was. I didn't react. Not outwardly. I simply nodded once, like I had heard something irrelevant, and adjusted the cuff of my jacket as if nothing had changed. But something had changed. Because in that single sentence, I wasn't just reduced in status, I was erased of context, stripped down to the simplest version of myself that required no further explanation. Mark raised his eyebrows slightly, as if trying to decide whether to believe what he had just heard or read deeper into it, but Emily had already moved on, laughing softly at something someone else said at the table. The conversation continued around me, glasses refilled, chairs shifting, voices overlapping, yet for a moment I felt like I was standing outside of it all, watching a life I technically belonged to but was not fully seen in. I took a slow sip of water, letting the cold glass steady my hand, and scanned the room quietly. That's when I noticed something unusual. At the far end of the table, a man I hadn't met yet, someone named Daniel Carter, had gone completely still. He wasn't laughing, wasn't talking, wasn't even pretending to be distracted. His eyes were fixed on me, not in judgment, but in recognition, like he was trying to place a memory that refused to come into focus. And in that moment, without anyone else noticing, the entire atmosphere around the table began to feel just a little bit heavier, like something unspoken had just entered the room and no one knew it yet. The silence around the table did not last long, but it changed shape in a way I could feel more than hear. Conversations restarted, glasses clinked again, and polite laughter returned, yet something underneath had shifted, like a floorboard slightly loosened that only I seemed to notice. I stayed still, keeping my posture relaxed, letting the rhythm of the room continue without me forcing anything into it. Emily was already back in conversation with her coworkers, leaning in slightly as she spoke about quarterly targets and upcoming project deadlines, completely unaware that the words she had used about me were still hanging in the air like dust that had not settled yet. I could hear fragments of the conversation around me, mostly business talk, casual jokes, and references to clients I did not recognize, but I was not focused on any of that. My attention kept drifting back to Daniel Carter at the far end of the table. He had not joined in the laughter, had not made a single comment since the introduction, and now he was doing something even more unusual. He was watching me like a man trying to solve a problem he had seen before but could not immediately place. I took a slow sip of water and pretended not to notice, though I could feel his attention like a weight across the table. Mark Sullivan leaned back in his chair and glanced at me again, this time more openly, as if reassessing what kind of person he was sitting next to. "So you work on engines, right?" he asked casually, though there was a hint of curiosity underneath it now. Emily answered before I could, almost as if she was filling space in the conversation. "He fixes cars and things like that. Nothing complicated." It keeps him busy. She said it lightly, like it was a harmless description, but the phrasing landed differently this time. Not just mechanic, but something smaller, something less visible, something easier to dismiss. I gave a small nod again, not correcting her, not adding anything, just letting the moment pass. Years of experience had taught me that correcting perception in a room like this rarely changed anything in the way people saw you. It only made them look at you longer. And I preferred not to be looked at more than necessary. Across from me, Daniel Carter finally shifted in his seat. He adjusted his posture slightly, leaning forward just enough that I could tell his attention was now fully anchored on me. His expression was not hostile, not amused, but something quieter and more analytical, like a memory trying to surface. Then, without warning, he spoke, not loudly, but clearly enough that it cut through the surrounding noise. "I am sorry, what was your name again?" he asked. I answered calmly. "Jack Turner." The moment I said it, something changed in his face. It was subtle at first, just a tightening around the eyes, a pause in his breathing, but then it deepened into recognition. He leaned back slightly as if recalibrating everything he thought he understood about the table in front of him. Emily noticed the shift and looked between us, her smile still in place but now slightly uncertain, as if she had just missed a reference everyone else was beginning to understand. Daniel did not speak immediately after that. Instead, he looked down at the table for a brief moment, then back at me, as if confirming something internally. And in that pause, the energy around the table began to tighten again, not from laughter this time, but from something far more uncomfortable, the feeling that a conversation had just moved into territory no one else was prepared for. The moment Daniel Carter said nothing after hearing my name, the entire table seemed to shift into a quieter version of itself, as if everyone had collectively decided to lower their voices without being told. Emily continued speaking with one of her coworkers about upcoming corporate targets, but her tone now carried a slight hesitation, like she had noticed the change but did not yet understand its meaning. I remained still, hands resting calmly near my glass, maintaining the same controlled posture I had kept since the beginning of the evening. Mark Sullivan, however, seemed less comfortable now. He glanced between Daniel and me with a growing sense of curiosity that was beginning to override his earlier confidence. "Is everything all right?" Mark asked lightly, though his eyes suggested he already knew something was different. Daniel did not answer immediately. Instead, he leaned slightly forward again, studying me with a level of focus that no longer felt casual. Then he spoke in a measured tone. "I am trying to place something," he said. "Have you ever spent time in Chicago, Mr. Turner?" The question landed gently, but it immediately changed the rhythm of the table. Emily paused mid-sentence, her attention shifting toward us for the first time in a few minutes. I looked at Daniel for a brief moment before responding calmly. "Yes. I lived there for several years," I said without elaborating further. Daniel nodded slowly, as if confirming an internal calculation. There was a brief silence again, but this one felt heavier than before. Emily let out a small laugh, as if trying to ease the atmosphere. "Jack moved around a lot before we settled down," she said, her tone casual, almost dismissive. "Nothing too serious. Just work things." But Daniel did not react to her explanation. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and exhaled quietly, as if he had just aligned scattered pieces of information into something complete. "That is interesting," he said softly, more to himself than anyone else. Mark shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing that the dynamic of the table had changed but not understanding why. He attempted to regain control of the conversation by turning back to me. "So what exactly do you do as a mechanic?" he asked again, though the question now sounded less like a joke and more like an attempt to re-establish familiarity. Before I could answer, Daniel raised his hand slightly, signaling a pause. The movement was subtle but enough to silence the table. He looked directly at me now, his expression steady but noticeably more serious. "I apologize for interrupting," he said carefully, "but I believe there may be a misunderstanding here." Emily frowned slightly, glancing at him with confusion. "What kind of misunderstanding?" she asked. Daniel hesitated for a brief moment, then spoke with deliberate clarity. I have seen your name before, Mr. Turner. Not in a casual context. The air around the table seemed to tighten again. Emily turned toward me, her expression shifting for the first time from confidence to uncertainty. Mark stopped moving entirely, his earlier smile fading. Daniel continued, his voice calm but firm. If you are the same Jack Turner I am thinking of, then you are not just a mechanic. He paused, letting the weight of that statement settle over the table. And in that silence, I could feel every pair of eyes beginning to re-examine the assumptions they had made only minutes earlier, as if the room itself had just started rewriting the story it thought it understood. The silence that followed Daniel Carter's words did not break immediately, it simply expanded, filling every corner of the table until even the smallest movements felt amplified. A glass being set down sounded sharper than it should have, and the soft background music from the restaurant seemed suddenly distant, almost irrelevant. Emily looked between Daniel and me with growing unease, her earlier confidence beginning to fracture in subtle ways she was trying to hide. Mark Sullivan leaned back slightly, no longer attempting humor or conversation, his expression now fully focused on understanding what he had missed. Daniel remained composed, his eyes still fixed on me, as if confirming something he had already begun to accept. Then he spoke again, slower this time, choosing each word carefully. I do not believe I am mistaken, he said. I have seen your name associated with a project group in Chicago several years ago. Not in a minor capacity. Emily shifted in her seat, her fork pausing halfway to her plate. That is not possible, she said quickly, almost reflexively. Jack does maintenance work. He fixes engines. That is all. Her voice carried a forced certainty, but it lacked the ease it had earlier in the evening. I remained quiet, letting the moment unfold without interruption, the way I had learned to do when conversations started moving faster than people's understanding. Daniel glanced briefly at Emily, then returned his attention to me. If I am correct, he continued, you were involved in infrastructure coordination for the North Ridge Development Initiative. That name does not belong to a mechanic. The reaction at the table was immediate, though restrained. Mark frowned slightly, as if trying to connect fragments of information that no longer fit together. Emily's posture stiffened, her hand resting now more firmly on the edge of the table. The environment around us, once casual and social, had shifted into something closer to evaluation. I took a slow breath, still not reacting outwardly, but I could feel the direction of the evening changing. Daniel was not guessing anymore. He was reconstructing. And every detail he spoke was pulling the conversation further away from the version of me that had been presented earlier. I may be mistaken about the exact project, Daniel added, though his tone suggested otherwise. But I am certain about the context. Your name was part of executive-level discussions. Emily turned toward me fully now, her expression no longer composed. Jack, what is he talking about? She asked, her voice lower than before. It was not accusation yet, but it was no longer certainty either. I looked at her briefly, then back at the table, letting the pause stretch just long enough to be noticed. Around us, the restaurant continued its evening rhythm, unaware of the shift happening in one small corner near the window. Daniel leaned back slightly, his hands resting together, as if he had completed a calculation he had been running since the moment I entered the room. If this is the same person, he said quietly, then this conversation is not about occupation at all. And in that instant, I could feel the entire table recalibrating again, not towards certainty, but towards something far more unstable, the possibility that everything they had assumed in the last 10 minutes had been wrong from the very beginning. The atmosphere at the table had changed so noticeably that even the smallest sounds now felt amplified, like the room itself was holding its breath. Emily had stopped speaking entirely, her attention fixed on Daniel Carter, waiting for an explanation that did not arrive quickly enough. Mark Sullivan shifted in his seat again, this time with visible discomfort, as if he was suddenly unsure whether he belonged in the conversation at all. Daniel remained calm, but there was a new weight in his presence now, the kind that came from certainty forming too quickly to be ignored. He looked at me once more before speaking, his tone steady and deliberate. "I am not making assumptions," he said. "I am recalling documentation. Your name appears in connection with advisory input from multiple development projects in the Midwest region." That sentence landed differently than anything before it. Emily turned fully toward me now, her expression tightening as she searched my face for something that would explain what she was hearing. "Jack," she said again, slower this time, "why would your name be in something like that?" Her voice no longer carried confidence, only confusion trying to hold itself together. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I looked briefly down at the table, then back up, maintaining the same calm expression I had kept the entire evening. Daniel noticed the silence and continued, almost carefully now, as if trying not to disrupt a fragile structure that had already begun to shift. "If I am correct," he said, "then your current presentation is incomplete at best." Mark let out a quiet breath, leaning forward slightly for the first time in several minutes. "Wait," he said, "are we talking about consulting work? Or something else entirely?" No one answered him right away. The question hung there without support, adding to the tension that had already built between every person seated at the table. Emily placed her glass down slowly, the movement controlled but no longer relaxed. "Jack works on cars," she said again, but this time her words sounded less like a statement and more like a reminder she was trying to convince herself of. Daniel did not react to that. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, studying me with a focus that had shifted from recognition to confirmation. "People are often misrepresented in informal settings," he said calmly. "That is usually how I encounter this pattern." The words were not accusatory, but they reframed everything that had been said so far. Emily looked increasingly unsettled, her earlier certainty replaced by something more fragile, something that was beginning to question itself. I finally lifted my gaze fully, not toward Daniel, but toward the space between everyone at the table. "I did not come here to be defined," I said quietly, my voice steady and even. The statement was not defensive, it was final in a way that stopped further questions for a moment. Daniel nodded slightly, as if acknowledging a boundary had just been drawn. Mark leaned back again, processing everything silently now, while Emily sat motionless, her expression caught between disbelief and uncertainty. The conversation did not continue immediately after that. Instead, the table settled into a new kind of silence, one that no longer felt casual or social, but transitional, as if everyone present understood that whatever they believed about me before this evening had already started to change beyond their control. The silence that followed my last statement did not disappear, it simply settled into a deeper layer of the room, one that made every small movement feel more deliberate than before. Emily remained still, her hands now resting closer to her glass but no longer touching it, as if she was uncertain whether to continue behaving normally or prepare for something she did not yet understand. Mark Sullivan glanced between Daniel Carter and me, his earlier attempts at casual curiosity completely gone, replaced with a quiet uncertainty that was beginning to mirror the atmosphere itself. Daniel, however, was no longer searching. He looked settled now, as if the fragments he had been collecting had finally aligned into something coherent. He adjusted his posture slightly and spoke in a tone that was calm but more decisive than before. "I am going to be direct," he said. "If you are the individual I believe you are, then your presence here is not incidental. It is contextual." Emily frowned immediately. "Contextual in what way?" she asked, her voice sharper now, though still controlled. Daniel did not answer her right away. Instead, he kept his focus on me, as if the explanation belonged more to recognition than permission. "There was a restructuring initiative involving multiple regional developments," he continued. "Advisory coordination, risk review, and long-term planning. The name Jack Turner appeared in internal briefings related to oversight recommendations." The words created a visible shift in Emily's expression. It was subtle at first, a tightening around her eyes, a pause in her breathing, like she was trying to reconcile what she was hearing with what she believed she already knew. "That cannot be right," she said, almost under her breath. "Jack does not work in anything like that." Her certainty, however, no longer sounded absolute. It sounded rehearsed, like she was repeating a version of reality that was beginning to lose its structure. I remained composed, saying nothing, allowing the conversation to move without interruption. Daniel finally shifted his attention slightly toward Emily. "Respectfully," he said, "that assumption may be the source of the misunderstanding." Mark leaned forward again, now fully engaged despite his earlier hesitation. "So what exactly are we saying here?" he asked. "Is this some kind of consulting situation or something bigger?" Daniel did not respond immediately, which only increased the tension at the table. Instead, he exhaled slowly, as if deciding how much clarity was appropriate for the moment. "It is not my place to disclose specifics in a public setting," he said at last. "However, I can confirm that certain individuals are not accurately categorized by surface-level occupation." Emily finally turned to me directly, her expression now fully unsettled. "Jack," she said again, but this time her voice carried less authority and more hesitation. "Why would any of this be connected to you?" I met her gaze calmly, not raising my voice, not shifting my posture, simply letting the question exist without rushing to resolve it. "Because assumptions are often more convenient than facts," I said evenly. The statement was not defensive, it was neutral, but it landed heavily in the space between us. Daniel nodded slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging that the conversation had reached a point of clarity he had already anticipated. Around the table, no one spoke. The background sounds of the restaurant continued, plates being cleared, distant laughter from another section of the room, soft music playing through unseen speakers, but none of it felt connected to the table anymore. It was as if a boundary had formed around us, separating this moment from everything else. Emily looked down briefly, then back up, her expression no longer confident, but searching. Mark leaned back slowly, as if giving himself time to process what he no longer felt qualified to interpret. And Daniel Carter, now completely certain in his tone, simply said, "At this point, I believe the correct question is not what he does, but what you thought you knew." And in that moment, the entire table seemed to understand that whatever direction the evening had taken, it was no longer guided by introduction or assumption, but by something far more irreversible. The moment Daniel Carter finished speaking, the silence at the table deepened again, but this time it was no longer uncertain or confused. It was reflective, as if every person present was now silently replaying everything they had said since I first sat down. Emily's expression had changed noticeably, her earlier confidence now replaced with something more fragile, something that kept trying to stabilize itself but could not find solid ground. She looked at me repeatedly, as if searching for a version of me that matched the simple label she had used earlier in the evening, but that version no longer seemed to fit the conversation unfolding in front of her. Mark Sullivan cleared his throat slightly, attempting to regain some sense of normal social rhythm, but even his voice sounded less certain when he finally spoke. "So just to be clear," he said carefully, "this is not about a job title anymore, is it?" Daniel turned toward him briefly, then answered in a measured tone. "Titles are often the least accurate representation of actual responsibility," he said. "What matters is function and influence within a structure." Emily exhaled slowly, her hand now resting flat on the table as if grounding herself physically. "I do not understand," she said, and for the first time her voice carried something closer to vulnerability than control. "If any of this is real, why would Jack not say anything?" The question hung in the air, directed at no one in particular, but clearly aimed at me. I remained calm, my posture unchanged, my attention steady. There was no need to rush into explanation, because explanation often reduced things that were not meant to be reduced. Daniel observed the exchange quietly, then spoke again with a slightly lowered voice, as if choosing precision over volume. "In many professional environments," he said, "individuals with high-level advisory roles are not publicly identified in casual contexts. That is a matter of structure, not secrecy." Mark leaned back again, processing this more slowly now. "So you are saying he could be involved in something significant, but it would not be obvious," he said. Daniel gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Emily looked down at the table for a moment, then back up at me, her expression now fully conflicted. The earlier assumption she had presented so confidently no longer seemed stable enough to stand on its own. "Jack," she said again, but this time more quietly, "why would you let people think something else?" I turned my gaze toward her directly, not with confrontation, but with calm clarity. "Because most people decide what they believe long before they ask questions," I said evenly. That answer did not resolve anything, but it shifted the emotional weight in the room. Mark stopped speaking entirely, his attention now fixed on Daniel, as if waiting for confirmation that this conversation was still grounded in reality. Daniel, however, looked satisfied in a way that suggested he had already reached his conclusion. "Then I am correct," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. "This is not a misunderstanding. It is a misclassification." The word lingered in the air longer than expected. Emily's face tightened slightly again, not in anger, but in discomfort, as if she was realizing that the framework she had used to define the evening, and possibly me, was no longer reliable. The restaurant continued its normal activity around us, but the table itself felt separated from it, like a conversation taking place in a different layer of attention. And in that separation, it became increasingly clear that whatever assumptions had brought us to this point were no longer capable of explaining what was unfolding now. The word, misclassification, remained in the air long after Daniel Carter finished speaking, settling over the table like a final layer of meaning that no one had fully processed yet. Emily was the first to break eye contact, looking down at her hands as if they no longer belonged in this conversation. Her earlier confidence had not just weakened, it had been replaced by a careful silence, the kind that forms when a person realizes the situation they are in may not be the one they thought they were managing. Mark Sullivan shifted slightly in his chair, glancing between Daniel and me, his expression now fully stripped of casual humor. He looked like someone trying to rebuild context from fragments that no longer aligned. Daniel, however, remained composed, his posture unchanged, his attention still directed toward me with a level of certainty that had only grown stronger since he first spoke. He finally leaned back slightly and spoke again, his tone quieter but more definitive. "I want to clarify something," he said. "This is not speculation. It is recognition." Emily looked up immediately, her voice now less steady. "Recognition of what exactly?" she asked. Daniel paused for a brief moment, then continued. "Of professional identity that does not match the surface description given earlier." The phrasing caused Mark to exhale slowly, as if the conversation had moved too far beyond his ability to comfortably interpret. Emily turned toward me again, her expression now a mixture of confusion and disbelief. "Jack," she said, "why would someone at this table recognize you in a way I do not?" The question was no longer rhetorical. It was direct, and it carried weight. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I allowed the silence to exist without interference, knowing that any rushed explanation would only reduce what was already unfolding into something smaller than it was. Daniel watched the exchange carefully, then spoke once more, this time with a tone that suggested conclusion rather than continuation. "Because context defines perception," he said. "And perception is often incomplete in informal environments." Emily pressed her lips together slightly, her composure visibly strained now. "So what are you actually saying?" she asked slowly. "That I have been wrong about who my husband is this entire time?" The question hung in the space between us, no longer anchored in curiosity but in the realization that certainty itself was being challenged. Mark looked down at the table briefly, then back up, as if trying to determine whether he was witnessing a misunderstanding or a correction of one. Daniel did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked at me again, as if confirming the final piece of a structure only he could see clearly. "I am saying," he finally replied, "that if my understanding is correct, then the assumption presented earlier in this evening is not just incomplete. It is fundamentally inaccurate." The impact of that statement was immediate but quiet. Emily's posture stiffened slightly, her eyes fixed now on the table's surface as if it contained information she had missed. The earlier description she had given, the casual dismissal, the simplified explanation, all of it now felt unstable in the context of what was being suggested. I remained still, allowing the moment to resolve itself without interruption, while the space around us seemed to shift again, no longer defined by introductions or impressions, but by the slow collapse of certainty. And in that collapse, the table had reached a point where no one was speaking simply to respond anymore, but instead to understand what they had already misunderstood. The silence that followed Daniel Carter's last statement did not end so much as it evolved into something heavier, something that made the entire table feel like it had stopped participating in the rest of the restaurant. Conversations around us continued in distant fragments, but none of it reached where we were sitting, as if an invisible boundary had formed between our table and everything else. Emily remained still, her gaze lowered now, her earlier certainty fully dissolved into a quiet uncertainty that she no longer seemed able to control. Mark Sullivan looked increasingly uncomfortable, his attention shifting between each of us as though he was waiting for someone to confirm that the conversation still made sense. Daniel Carter, however, stayed composed, his focus steady and deliberate, as if everything he had said up to this point had only been the preparation for what he was about to confirm. He finally spoke again, his voice calm but carrying a weight that immediately drew full attention back to him. "At this stage," he said, "there is no ambiguity left in my assessment." Emily looked up immediately, her expression tense. "Then explain it," she said, her voice no longer defensive but strained, as if she was trying to hold on to the last version of reality she trusted. Daniel did not rush. He glanced briefly at me, then back to her. "Your husband is not functioning in the capacity you described earlier," he said. "That classification is inaccurate by a significant margin." Mark exhaled slowly, leaning back as if the situation had moved beyond anything he felt qualified to interpret. "So what are we actually dealing with here?" he asked quietly. Daniel paused for a moment before answering, choosing his words with precision. "We are dealing with an individual whose professional scope extends into areas that are not publicly visible in casual environments," he said. The phrasing caused Emily to visibly tense, her hands now clasped together on the table. "That does not answer the question," she said, her voice softer now. Daniel nodded slightly, acknowledging her point. "Then I will be direct," he replied. "If I am correct in my identification, then your husband has been involved in advisory-level decisions that influence large-scale operational structures. That is not consistent with the description given at the beginning of this evening." The words landed with a clarity that removed any remaining casual interpretation from the table. Emily turned slowly toward me again, her eyes searching now not for contradiction, but for explanation. "Jack," she said quietly, "why would you let me believe something so different from this?" I held her gaze for a moment, steady and composed, before answering. "Because belief is usually built from what is easiest to explain, not what is most accurate," I said. The answer did not comfort her, but it also did not escalate the moment further. Instead, it left space for realization to settle in its own time. Daniel leaned back slightly, his role in the conversation now appearing complete, as if he had reached the endpoint of his recognition. "Then my initial observation stands," he said calmly. "This evening did not begin with correct information." No one responded immediately. The table had reached a point where silence was no longer a pause between thoughts, but the only remaining way to process them. Emily looked down again, her expression now fully changed from the beginning of the night, no longer confident, no longer certain, but quietly recalibrating everything she thought she knew. And as the room around us continued unchanged, it became clear that what had shifted at this table was not just perception, but the foundation of understanding that each person had arrived with, now rewritten in real time without permission or preparation. The atmosphere at the table had settled into a stillness that felt more final than temporary, as if every person present understood that the conversation had moved beyond simple clarification and into something irreversible. Emily remained quiet, her posture unchanged, but her expression no longer carried the same certainty it had at the beginning of the evening. Instead, there was a subtle tension in her face, the kind that comes when long-held assumptions begin to lose their structure. Mark Sullivan had stopped attempting to engage in the conversation entirely. His focus now split between Daniel Carter and me, as if he was trying to determine where reality itself was anchored in what he was hearing. Daniel, however, maintained his calm composure, but there was a noticeable shift in him now, not in confidence, but in finality, as if he had completed the process of recognition he had been working through since the moment he first looked at me. He spoke again, but this time his voice carried a more restrained tone, one that suggested he was no longer interpreting, but concluding. "At this point," he said, "there is sufficient alignment between identity indicators and historical reference points to confirm my assessment." Emily blinked slowly, her brows tightening. "I do not understand what that means anymore," she said quietly. Daniel nodded slightly, acknowledging the complexity of what he had just stated. "It means," he continued, "that your initial description of your husband does not correspond with verifiable professional history." The words were precise, almost clinical, and they removed any remaining casual framing from the conversation. Emily looked at me again, but this time her expression carried something different, not disbelief, but the beginning of recalibration. "Jack," she said, her voice softer than before, "why did you never correct me?" The question lingered without urgency, but with weight. I took a slow breath, maintaining the same steady composure I had kept throughout the evening. "Correction requires a conversation that most people are not prepared to have in casual settings," I said evenly. The answer was simple, but it shifted the emotional direction of the table again. Mark leaned forward slightly, his curiosity returning, but now without humor. "So what exactly are we talking about here?" he asked. Daniel turned his attention briefly toward him, then back to me. "We are talking about someone whose role exists outside of the simplified categories that were initially applied," he said. Emily exhaled slowly, her hands now resting still on the table, no longer fidgeting. "This is not what I thought tonight was going to be," she said, almost to herself. Daniel nodded once, acknowledging the statement without expanding on it. "Most assumptions are built on incomplete visibility," he replied. The conversation did not continue immediately after that. Instead, the table entered a quieter state, not of confusion, but of reflection, as each person adjusted to the gradual erosion of certainty that had occurred in front of them. Emily finally looked down, then back up, her voice now measured but uncertain. "Then what am I supposed to believe about you?" she asked. I met her gaze calmly, without tension or urgency. "You are not required to replace one assumption with another immediately," I said. "You are only required to recognize when the previous one is no longer accurate." The words settled into the space between us, not as instruction, but as final clarification. Daniel leaned back slightly, his role in the exchange appearing complete, while Mark remained silent, processing everything without interruption. And for the first time since the conversation began, no one attempted to redefine the situation, because it had already shifted beyond the need for interpretation, leaving only the realization that nothing at this table had been as simple as it first appeared. The silence that followed lingered longer than anyone at the table seemed comfortable with, not because no one had anything left to say, but because every possible interpretation of what had already been said now felt incomplete. Emily sat still, her hands folded tightly in front of her, her earlier confidence fully replaced by a quiet uncertainty that she seemed to be trying to manage internally rather than express outwardly. Mark Sullivan shifted in his chair again, attempting to reintroduce normal conversation by adjusting his tone, but even his words lacked the ease they had carried earlier in the evening. Daniel Carter remained composed, his posture unchanged, his attention still directed toward me, but now with a sense of finality that suggested he was no longer analyzing, only confirming what he already believed to be true. Emily finally broke the silence, her voice softer than before, but noticeably strained. "This is not making sense anymore," she said. "I feel like I am missing something fundamental." Her eyes moved between Daniel and me, searching for alignment in a situation that no longer offered any. Mark exhaled slowly and leaned back slightly, as if physically distancing himself from the uncertainty at the table. "Maybe we are overthinking this," he said cautiously, though it sounded more like an attempt to stabilize the atmosphere than a real conclusion. Daniel did not react immediately. Instead, he looked down briefly at the table, then back up at me, as if weighing whether the next statement should be made at all. "There is a point where clarification becomes verification," he said calmly. Emily frowned slightly. "Verification of what exactly?" she asked, her tone now carrying both confusion and frustration. Daniel paused for a moment, then continued. "Verification of identity against known professional records," he said. The phrasing caused a noticeable shift in Emily's posture again, her attention sharpening despite her visible emotional fatigue. "That sounds extreme," she said quietly. Daniel nodded once, acknowledging her reaction without disputing it. "It is standard when discrepancies reach a certain threshold," he replied. I remained still, observing the exchange without interruption, allowing each reaction to unfold without influence. Mark glanced at me again, this time with a more direct focus, as if trying to reconcile the calmness in my demeanor with the uncertainty being introduced around me. "So what happens next in a situation like this?" he asked. Daniel turned slightly toward him. "It depends on whether clarification is voluntary or externally confirmed," he said. The words introduced a new layer of tension into the conversation, not through threat, but through implication of process beyond the table itself. Emily's voice lowered further. "I do not understand why any of this is happening during a dinner," she said, her frustration now tempered by fatigue. "This was supposed to be simple." Daniel looked at her briefly. "Most assumptions are simple only until they encounter contradiction," he said. Emily turned toward me again, her expression now less defensive and more searching. "Jack, please," she said. "Just tell me what is actually going on." I met her gaze steadily, maintaining the same controlled composure I had kept throughout the evening. "What is going on?" I said calmly. "Is that the version of events you were given does not align with the full context?" The answer did not satisfy her, but it also did not escalate the situation further. Instead, it left a widening gap between perception and explanation that no one at the table immediately knew how to bridge. Daniel adjusted his posture slightly, as if preparing to transition the conversation into its final stage. "At this point," he said quietly, "there is one remaining step if confirmation is required." Mark looked between us, clearly uncertain whether to remain engaged or withdraw from the exchange entirely. Emily, however, did not speak. She simply watched, waiting for something definitive to either confirm or resolve everything that had been building since the moment Daniel first recognized me. And in that suspended silence, it became clear that the conversation was no longer about interpretation, but about what would be proven next. The table remained still in a way that no longer felt like calm, but like anticipation that had nowhere left to go. Emily had stopped speaking entirely, her eyes fixed on Daniel Carter as if waiting for a final explanation that would either restore the version of reality she understood or permanently replace it with something unfamiliar. Mark Sullivan had shifted his attention fully now, no longer pretending this was casual conversation, his posture slightly forward, his expression tense with expectation. Daniel, however, had entered a different state of focus, quieter and more deliberate, as if he had moved past interpretation and was now operating within procedure. He finally spoke again, his voice steady and controlled. "At this stage," he said, "verbal clarification is no longer sufficient for resolution." Emily's expression tightened immediately. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice lower than before, carrying a trace of fatigue and disbelief. Daniel paused briefly before answering, as if choosing words that would not escalate the situation unnecessarily. "It means," he said, "that confirmation requires formal verification through authorized channels." Mark blinked slowly. "Authorized channels for what exactly?" he asked. Daniel turned slightly toward him. "For identity validation against institutional records," he replied. The phrase caused a noticeable shift in the atmosphere again, not louder, but heavier, as if the conversation had crossed an invisible threshold. Emily looked at me immediately, her voice now more fragile than before. "Jack, this is not normal," she said quietly. I met her gaze without urgency, maintaining the same calm presence I had held since the beginning of the evening. "Not everything that feels unexpected is abnormal," I said evenly. Daniel nodded slightly, as if acknowledging that response without needing to evaluate it further. "There is a final step," he said, returning his attention to the table. "If confirmation is still required, I can initiate direct verification now." Mark leaned back slightly, processing this carefully. "Initiate with who?" he asked. Daniel did not hesitate. "With the appropriate registry contact responsible for regional advisory records," he said. The words created a brief silence that no one interrupted. Emily's hands were now completely still on the table, her earlier attempts at maintaining composure fully replaced by uncertainty that she no longer tried to hide. "You are saying you can verify this right now?" she said slowly. Daniel nodded once. "If authorization is granted," he replied. The structure of the conversation had shifted again, no longer relying on interpretation or assumption, but on the possibility of external confirmation. Mark looked between us, his expression now fully focused on understanding the implications of what was being proposed. "And if the records match what you are suggesting," he asked carefully, "then what changes?" Daniel held a brief pause before answering. "Then the classification of this conversation is corrected accordingly," he said. Emily turned toward me again, her voice quieter now, almost restrained. "Jack, are you going to let him do this?" she asked. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I allowed the question to settle, recognizing that it was no longer about permission, but about what truth would remain once external validation entered the room. Daniel waited patiently, his attention steady, as if the final outcome was already a matter of procedure rather than debate. And in that moment, the table felt suspended between two states of understanding, one built on assumption and familiarity, and another waiting to be defined by confirmation that none of us could undo once it arrived. The request for authorization did not feel like a dramatic moment, it felt procedural, as if the outcome had already been decided and what remained was simply the formal completion of a system that did not depend on emotion or opinion. Emily sat motionless now, her hands no longer moving at all, her attention fixed on Daniel Carter with a mixture of tension and anticipation that she was no longer trying to conceal. Mark Sullivan had also gone completely quiet, his earlier uncertainty replaced with a focused stillness, as if he understood that whatever happened next would define the meaning of everything that had been said so far. Daniel held his position calmly, waiting for acknowledgement rather than reaction. He finally spoke again, his tone unchanged. "If there are no objections," he said, "I will proceed with verification request transmission." No one answered immediately. The absence of response functioned as consent in the space between them. Daniel reached for his phone and made a brief, controlled interaction, his movements precise and unhurried. The table remained silent while he initiated the process, the surrounding restaurant continuing its normal rhythm as if completely unaware that something significant was being resolved in one corner of the room. Emily's gaze shifted briefly toward me, her expression now fully uncertain, no longer anchored in any assumption she had held earlier. "What is going to happen now?" she asked quietly, not to Daniel, but to the space between all of us. Daniel did not look up immediately. "A standard identity verification query will be processed through the designated registry channel," he said. The words were calm, factual, and final. Mark leaned slightly forward again, his voice low. "How long does that usually take?" he asked. Daniel paused briefly. "It depends on response prioritization," he said. The answer did not provide comfort, only structure. Emily looked down at the table again, then back up at me, her voice softer now, almost uncertain. "Jack," she said, "I do not understand how any of this exists without me knowing." I met her gaze steadily, without urgency or interruption. Most systems do not operate in visible layers, I said calmly. That statement seemed to land differently, not as explanation, but as a reframing of everything she had assumed about access and awareness. The table returned to silence once more. Daniel remained still, watching his device, waiting. Mark no longer spoke, his attention fixed on the process unfolding in real time. Emily exhaled slowly, her posture still tense but no longer defensive. Then, after what felt like several long minutes, Daniel's phone gave a subtle notification. He looked at it immediately, his expression unchanged, but his focus sharpened. The room around the table seemed to contract again, as if all attention had been pulled into that single point. Daniel read the response quietly, then lifted his gaze. For the first time since the beginning of the conversation, there was a noticeable shift in his composure, not surprise, but confirmation. He turned the screen slightly toward the table, though not everyone needed to see it to understand that something had changed. Emily's eyes moved to it immediately, her expression tightening as she processed what she was reading. Mark leaned in slightly, his face now completely serious. Daniel spoke one final time, his voice steady but definitive. "Verification is complete," he said. The pause that followed carried more weight than anything said earlier. Emily looked at me, her voice barely above a whisper now. "Jack," she said, but did not finish the sentence. I did not respond immediately. There was no need. Because in that moment, the version of me that had been casually defined at the start of the evening no longer existed in the space they thought they understood. And as the implications settled across the table without noise or explanation, it became clear that what had just been confirmed was not simply identity, but the complete collapse of every assumption that had been used to describe it.